Have you ever wondered how a nation at the southern tip of South America once rose to become one of the richest economies on Earth, only to plunge into chaos and crisis within a few decades? Argentina, land of the haunting tango, the boundless Pampas, and fierce battles for power, has known triumphs as dazzling as its falls have been brutal. Its streets have danced in joy and bled in silence. In this journey, we will uncover the complete history of Argentina, from the first footprints of its native peoples to the turbulent events of today, to understand why this country still stands proud against every storm. Before there was a name, before there was a border to be drawn on any map, this immense stretch of land we now call Argentina lay under a sky that seemed endlessly deep, its seasons ruled by the wind, its horizons unbroken except by the jagged silhouettes of the Andes to the west and the shifting silver of the Atlantic to the east. And here, in this place of open grasslands, high mountains, and fertile river valleys, lived peoples whose histories were not written in books or recorded in ledgers, but carried in the stories they told around fires and in the quiet knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The Mapuche, whose domain stretched far into what is now Chile and across the Andes into the fertile lands of Patagonia, were masters of adaptation. They understood the cycles of the land and the moods of the mountains. They hunted guanacos and rias. They gathered roots and wild berries. And they wove complex patterns into their textiles that were more than decoration. They were symbols of lineage, power, and the unseen threads connecting the living to their ancestors. And in the Guarani villages to the northeast, where the rivers Paraná and Uruguay flowed like two vast, restless arteries through dense forests, life followed the rhythm of fishing, planting maize and cassava, and a spirituality that saw the world as a fragile balance between the material and the sacred. Across the Pampas, a sea of grass that seemed to stretch into infinity. Nomadic groups moved with the herds they hunted, tracking the migrations of deer and the flight of birds, shaping their lives around the patterns of nature's abundance and scarcity. To them, the open plain was both home and challenge, a place where survival demanded knowledge of every change in the wind and the soil, where the sky was not a backdrop, but an active force, bringing storms without warning and sunlight so fierce it could bleach bone. In the northwest, high in the Andean valleys, the Diaguita and related peoples cultivated terraced fields, building stone walls that clung to the slopes like the ribs of the earth itself. And here potatoes, maize, and quinoa grew alongside herds of llamas and alpacas that provided wool and meat. And the people developed pottery painted in geometric designs, ceremonial vessels that spoke of a belief in continuity beyond death. For in their cosmology, the mountains were alive, guardians that could bless or curse. And to neglect them was to invite disaster. The land itself shaped these cultures as much as they shaped the land. The meeting of climates, from subtropical jungles to frozen peaks, created a diversity of ecosystems that required distinct ways of living, yet threads of similarity ran through them all. Respect for the land spirits, reliance on kinship networks, and an oral tradition that ensured memories of migrations, battles, and alliances endured long after the individuals who experienced them were gone. But this world, balanced between abundance and fragility, was not isolated from the wider currents of change sweeping the continents. For long before the sails of Spain appeared on the horizon, trade routes of obsidian, shell, and feathers linked the Pampas to the Andes and beyond, carrying not only goods, but also stories, songs, and technologies. Influences from the Inca Empire in the north reached into the Argentine northwest, bringing new crops, building techniques, and religious imagery, though never fully erasing local identities. It was a world in which power was measured not in gold or written law, but in the ability to read the signs of the land. to lead a hunt that would feed an entire community, to heal the sick with plants whose properties were known only to the initiated, to mediate between the seen and unseen realms. And in the long arc of time, this pre-colonial Argentina was not a static backdrop awaiting discovery, but a living, changing mosaic of human societies, each carrying a memory of the past and a claim to the future. Claims that would be challenged, dismantled, and in many places destroyed when the winds from across the ocean brought with them languages, diseases, weapons, and gods that the people of the Pampas, the forests, and the mountains had never known. When the first ships of Castile appeared on the shimmering horizon of the Atlantic in the early decades of the 16th century, they did not arrive quietly, nor with the tentative steps of guests seeking permission to enter, but with the clatter of armor, the creak of wooden hulls swollen with salt, and the burning conviction that the lands they were about to step upon, lands they neither knew nor understood, were theirs by divine right, granted through papal bulls and royal decrees that could not be read by the people whose homes and hunting grounds lay beyond the mouth of the great river. Pedro de Mendoza, appointed adelantado by the Spanish crown in 1534, led his expedition with the fevered ambition of a man who carried not only the promise of wealth, but the weight of imperial expectation. And when he founded Buenos Aires in 1536 on the southern bank of the Rio de la Plata, the settlement was less a city than a fragile outpost surrounded by vast pampas whose grasses whispered in an alien tongue. And from the very first days, survival proved more elusive than conquest, for the Querandí, skilled hunters of the plain, resisted Spanish demands for food and labor, severing the fragile lines of supply and forcing the newcomers to face the raw truth that they were strangers in a land whose rhythms they could neither predict nor control. The colony's early years were marked by hunger so severe that men boiled leather to stave off death, by diseases that spread quickly in the cramped wooden structures by the riverbank, and by skirmishes that revealed the Spaniards' steel could kill but not conquer the will of those defending their territory. Eventually, Buenos Aires was abandoned, its skeletal remains left to the wind and the grass. And the surviving settlers moved upriver to Asunción, where the climate was kinder and Guarani alliances offered a lifeline. But Spain's designs on the southern cone did not die with the first failed settlement. Decades later, Buenos Aires was refounded in 1580 by Juan de Garay, this time with settlers from Asunción and a vision of permanence, fortified not only with walls and soldiers, but with a system of land grants, encomiendas, and rigid social hierarchies that would weave the fabric of colonial society. One in which peninsulares and criollos sat atop the pyramid. Mestizos and free people of color navigated its middle ground, and indigenous peoples and African slaves bore the crushing weight of its base. From this point onward, the land that would become Argentina was drawn ever more tightly into the administrative and economic machinery of the Spanish Empire. The Rio de la Plata served as both a gateway and a choke point, channeling trade through routes sanctioned by the crown. And while silver from the mines of Potosi passed through, the port itself remained restricted by mercantilist policies that favored Lima and Cadiz, ensuring Buenos Aires grew more restless. With each year it was denied free commerce, for smuggling became as much a lifeblood as sanctioned trade, and merchants learned to navigate the shadows as deftly as the official docks. Missionaries, Jesuits, Franciscans, and Dominicans moved through the interior with crosses and catechisms, building missions among the Guarani and other peoples, teaching Christian doctrine alongside new agricultural practices, yet always with the underlying aim of reshaping indigenous identities into forms that could be folded into the imperial order. And while some missions flourished as semi-autonomous communities, others were destroyed in the collisions of colonial ambition, indigenous resistance, and rival European powers who looked hungrily at the same fertile lands. The arrival of the Spanish was not a single event, but the beginning of an unending process of settlement and abandonment, of conquest and retreat, of treaties signed and broken, that would transform not only the demography of the land, but its very soul. For with them came horses that would reshape the hunting patterns of the Pampas, cattle that would graze where wild herds once roamed, wheat that would root in soils long accustomed to other seeds, and a faith that promised salvation while demanding submission. And in their wake trailed the diseases of the old world, invisible armies far more devastating than any regiment, softening the ground for the structures of empire to take root. In the long shadow cast by the banners of Spain, Buenos Aires and the surrounding territories settled into the heavy, deliberate rhythm of a colonial outpost whose fate was tethered to the distant will of the crown. For from the late 16th century onward, life here unfolded within the narrow corridors of imperial policy, where every cargo of hides, every barrel of tallow, every chest of contraband silver was subject to the suffocating embrace of mercantilism. A system designed less to nourish the colonies than to feed the voracious hunger of the metropolis, ensuring that the Rio de la Plata remained a tightly controlled artery through which wealth could flow towards Seville and Cadiz, but seldom in the opposite direction. Administratively, the region was bound first to the Viceroyalty of Peru, whose distant capital in Lima functioned as the nerve center of Spain's South American possessions. And later, after long years of lobbying, economic frustration, and political maneuvering, to the newly created Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata in 1776. A move that elevated Buenos Aires to a position of greater prominence, but also increased the crown's surveillance over its activities. For with official status came tighter control, more soldiers, and a renewed insistence that loyalty to Spain was not a matter of choice, but a binding, unquestionable obligation. Within this structure, the economic life of colonial Argentina was both constrained and opportunistic. For while the crown restricted legal trade, the fertile Pampas and the proximity to maritime routes created conditions for a thriving underground economy. Merchants, ranchers, and sailors, some Spanish, some Creole, and many neither entirely legal nor entirely defiant, learned to move goods quietly, to deal with Portuguese traders from Brazil, to slip past customs officers under the cover of night. And in doing so, they nurtured a spirit of independence and self-reliance that the crown could never fully stamp out. The rural economy revolved increasingly around cattle, whose numbers multiplied across the Pampas until they were as much a part of the landscape as the grass itself. Hides and tallow became the principal exports, feeding industries in Europe, while the meat, too perishable to ship, was consumed locally or left to rot, a paradox that embodied the distortions of a colonial system that valued raw materials for export over the full nourishment of those who produced them. And in the countryside, the gauchos, skilled horsemen of mixed heritage, emerged as both laborers and symbols, their lives bound to the herds they tended. Their independence both celebrated in ballads and feared by authorities who saw in them a dangerous resistance to centralized control. But the wealth generated by these lands did not flow evenly through society. At the top stood the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe, who held the highest offices and guarded their privileges jealously against the rising aspirations of the Criollos. Spaniards born in the Americas, whose economic power often outstripped their political influence, creating a simmering tension that would one day boil over into demands for change. While below them, mestizos, indigenous laborers, and African slaves bore the brunt of the work that sustained both the legal and illicit economies, their contributions acknowledged in neither the ledgers of profit nor the annals of imperial pride. Religion, too, was a pillar of colonial domination, with the Catholic Church acting as both moral authority and landowner, its missions and monasteries extending deep into the interior, where they converted, educated, and sometimes sheltered indigenous communities, yet also participated in the suppression of native beliefs, the reshaping of identities, and the justification of Spain's claim to rule as divinely ordained. The church bells that called the faithful to Mass each morning were also, in a sense, the tolling of the empire's reach into every soul it could touch. In the plazas of Buenos Aires, under the shade of arcaded buildings and the watchful eyes of officials, markets bustled with goods from across the Atlantic. Fabrics from Spain, wine from Mendoza, silver from Potosi, and alongside them, goods from the shadow market, the contraband that kept the city's economy alive in ways the crown could not publicly acknowledge. And in these markets, news from abroad also circulated, whispers of revolutions in distant lands, of new ideas about rights and governance, of empires rising and falling, ideas that would take root in minds already weary of distant control. Thus, the colonial era in Argentina was one of constant tension between what the crown decreed and what the land demanded, between the rigid lines drawn by imperial law and the fluid realities of a society adapting to its own rhythms. And though the empire appeared solid, each restriction, each act of exploitation, each humiliation inflicted upon those who tilled the soil and drove the herds was another small fracture in the edifice. Cracks that would widen when the world beyond the Atlantic erupted in wars, revolutions, and the slow unraveling of the very system that had bound these lands for centuries. By the time the colonial system had sunk its roots deep into the soil of the Rio de la Plata, the peoples who had roamed these lands for millennia were no longer living in the freedom of their ancestors. For the slow violence of conquest, carried not always by the blade or the bullet, but by the invisible hand of disease, the grinding demands of forced labor, and the steady erosion of cultural autonomy, had reduced once thriving nations to fragments of their former selves, scattered across missions and comiendas and remote refuges where survival itself became an act of defiance against a world remade in the image of the conqueror. The great epidemics, smallpox, measles, influenza, arrived not with fanfare but as silent storms, sweeping through villages that had no immunity to these old-world pathogens, killing elders who carried the oral histories, children who were meant to inherit them, and warriors who might have defended their people. In some communities, the mortality was so total that entire languages fell silent, leaving behind only place names and the memories of neighboring tribes who would themselves soon be diminished. And it was in this void that the colonizers expanded their reach, taking lands whose stewards no longer remained to guard them. Those indigenous peoples who survived the first waves of devastation often found themselves drawn into the orbit of the encomenda system, compelled to labor in fields, workshops, or domestic service under the guise of Christian tutelage, a structure that promised protection in exchange for work, but in reality functioned as a mechanism for extracting labor while binding the worker in perpetual dependency. Others were relocated to Jesuit missions, where the intent to shield them from the abuses of colonial society existed alongside the equally forceful intent to reshape them into obedient subjects of the crown and the church, erasing ancestral rights, reorganizing communal life, and replacing the spiritual cosmologies of the Pampas, the forests, and the mountains with the catechism. Yet even as the native population diminished under these pressures, the labor demands of the growing colonial economy increased, and into this breach stepped another tragic chapter. The forced arrival of African slaves, brought across the Atlantic in the holds of Portuguese and Spanish ships, many landing first in Brazil and then transported overland or by sea to Buenos Aires. where they were sold in markets whose transactions reduced human beings to entries in an account book. They worked in the households of the elite, in small workshops, and as dock laborers unloading the very ships that had carried them into bondage. Their presence becoming an indelible but often unacknowledged part of Argentina's cultural and demographic fabric. The city's streets, by the 17th and 18th centuries, rang with the polyglot sounds of a society layered with identities. Peninsular Spanish, Creole Spanish, Mestizo, African, Indigenous, and the complex intersections of all three. And though the colonial order placed these groups into rigid hierarchies, life on the margins created spaces where music, language, and custom mingled, planting seeds for cultural forms that would one day flourish far beyond their humble origins. But in the present of that time, these exchanges occurred under the constant weight of surveillance, coercion, and the omnipresent knowledge that one's freedom could be revoked by the stroke of a quill or the whim of a master. The Pampas, once dominated by mobile indigenous groups, saw the gradual encroachment of ranching estates, estancias, that fenced and parceled the land, restricting the movements of the remaining nomadic peoples, many of whom resisted in skirmishes that rarely entered the official record except as raids or pacifications, euphemisms that concealed the realities of dispossession and reprisal. For the colonial authorities, the frontier was both a threat and an opportunity, a space to be subdued not only by soldiers, but by settlers whose presence would civilize the wilderness through the imposition of European-style agriculture and property law. This dual process, the destruction of indigenous autonomy and the importation of coerced labor from across the ocean, was not merely incidental to the building of colonial Argentina. It was foundational for the wealth that would later fund grand architecture in Buenos Aires, the ships that would carry hides and tallow to Europe, and the fortunes that would give rise to political dynasties, all rested on the backs of those who had been uprooted, enslaved, or made to serve in systems designed to extract without replenishing. And beneath the official narratives of progress and civilization lay a far older truth, that the soil of the Pampas and the cobblestones of the city were watered with the sweat and blood of those who had no voice in deciding the fate of the land they worked. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Spanish Empire, once a vast, glittering network of territories that stretched from the cold waters of the North Atlantic to the silver mines of the Andes and the spice ports of the Philippines, was beginning to show the deep fractures of an edifice that had expanded too far, relied too heavily on resources it could not always control, and resisted the winds of change that were sweeping across the globe. For the political order that had seemed so immovable in the previous century was now being shaken by forces both external and internal, each one striking at the legitimacy and authority of the crown in ways that would have seemed unthinkable to the governors of an earlier age. The ideas of the Enlightenment, born in the salons of Paris, the lecture halls of Edinburgh, and the radical pamphlets of Philadelphia, had begun to seep into the intellectual life of the Americas, carried in the cargo holds of merchant ships, hidden in the libraries of Criollo elites, and whispered in the gatherings of students and lawyers who questioned why the principles of liberty, equality, and the rights of man should not apply to the colonies as well as to the metropole. And these ideas did not arrive in isolation, for they were accompanied by news of revolutions that had actually succeeded. The American colonies breaking from Britain in 1776, the French overthrowing their monarchy in 1789, and most dramatically for the Spanish crown, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue rising in the Haitian Revolution to destroy the plantation order and create the first Black Republic in the New World. Each of these events, while distant in geography, was close in consequence, for they undermined the moral and political claim that European powers had to rule the Americas by divine and natural right. And they offered living proof that empires could be challenged, monarchies could fall, and new nations could be forged from the determination of people long denied a voice. For the criollos of Buenos Aires and the interior provinces, these were not merely inspiring tales, but warnings and opportunities, suggesting that Spain's grip could be loosened if the moment was seized. That moment drew nearer with the Napoleonic Wars. For when Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808, forcing King Ferdinand VII to abdicate and installing his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne, the legitimacy of colonial governance was thrown into doubt. If the king had been overthrown, to whom did the colonies owe their loyalty? And if the mother country itself was occupied, could the provinces of the Rio de la Plata not govern themselves in the name of the deposed monarch? Or perhaps even in their own name? In Buenos Aires, this question was sharpened by a recent memory, the British invasions of 1806 and 1807, in which local militias, composed largely of criollos, had successfully repelled British forces with minimal assistance from Spain, proving both to themselves and to the world that they were capable of defending their territory without relying entirely on the imperial garrison. This victory not only elevated figures like Santiago de Liniers to prominence, but also planted the seed that military and political authority could reside locally, independent of orders from across the ocean. Meanwhile, Spain's economic policies, already resented for their restrictions on trade, became even more unsustainable in the face of global shifts. As Britain emerged from the Napoleonic Wars with naval dominance and a hunger for new markets, and merchants in Buenos Aires recognized that free trade with Britain and other powers could enrich the city far more than the monopolies and contraband networks of the colonial era. Thus, economic pragmatism aligned with political ambition, both pointing toward the same conclusion: the existing order was no longer viable. And so, by the eve of the May Revolution in 1810, the weakening of Spain was not merely a matter of military defeats or royal abdications, but the culmination of decades of structural strain. An empire too rigid to adapt, too indebted to reform, and too distant to respond swiftly to the needs and aspirations of its colonies. And in the streets of Buenos Aires, in the estancias of the Pampas, and in the highland towns of the interior, there was a growing sense, unspoken yet undeniable, that the destiny of these lands might no longer be tied to the fate of a crown struggling to survive on the far side of the world. When the news reached Buenos Aires in May of 1810, that the Spanish king remained a prisoner in France, and that the central authority in Spain itself had collapsed into a patchwork of juntas struggling to assert legitimacy in the face of Napoleon's occupation, it was as if a door that had long been bolted shut was suddenly blown open by a storm no one could stop. And through it poured not only the accumulated frustrations of decades under mercantilist restriction and distant governance, but also the heady conviction, nourished by Enlightenment ideals and recent military successes, that the people of the Rio de la Plata could and must take their fate into their own hands. The week that followed, now remembered as the Semana de Mayo, unfolded like the uncoiling of a spring wound tight for years, beginning with murmured meetings in the Cabildo, swelling into open debates between loyalists who insisted on waiting for clear orders from Spain and reformists who argued that authority had reverted to the people themselves, and culminating on May 25, 1810, when the crowd gathered in the Plaza Mayor under a chill autumn sky, pressing against the doors of the government house until the viceroy, Baltasar Hidalgo de Cisneros, was forced to step aside and a new Primera Junta was proclaimed. Its members drawn from the ranks of local patriots who promised to govern in the name of the deposed Ferdinand VII, but whose true course was already veering toward full independence. This was not yet a clean break. The rhetoric still cloaked in loyalty to a captive monarch, the moves calculated to avoid provoking outright war with Spain while consolidating local power. But the forces unleashed could not easily be contained. For once, the notion took hold that governance could be rooted in the will of the people rather than the distant command of a king. Every policy, every decree, every troop movement was weighed not only for its practical effect, but for what it signaled about the future and in the countryside. In the towns along the Paraná, in the Andean foothills, there were those who began to see themselves not as subjects, but as citizens of something yet unnamed. The years that followed were marked by both inspiration and hardship. As the newly formed government faced the dual challenge of defending its position against Spanish royalist forces, many entrenched in Upper Peru, the vital corridor to the mineral wealth of Potosí, and of persuading the disparate provinces to unite behind a single cause. For while Buenos Aires had lit the spark, not all regions were eager to follow its lead, and the tensions between centralism and federalism, between the port and the interior, already began to show in disputes over trade, military command, and representation. Leaders emerged whose names would be etched into the national memory. Manuel Belgrano, lawyer-turned-general who carried the revolutionary flag across the north. Juan José Castelli, the orator of the revolution, whose speeches fused political theory with fierce denunciations of tyranny. And Mariano Moreno, the sharp-minded secretary of the junta, whose vision of a republic was as radical as it was uncompromising, and whose sudden death at sea in 1811 left a wound in the movement's early leadership. But leadership was as perilous as it was necessary. For the path toward independence was strewn with defeats, betrayals, and the grinding reality of a war fought over vast distances with scarce resources. By 1816, after years of campaigns and shifting alliances, representatives from the provinces gathered in the Congress of Tucumán, where the veil of nominal loyalty to Ferdinand VII was finally cast aside, and on July 9th, they declared the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata to be free and independent, a statement as bold as it was fraught, for independence in name did not yet mean security in fact. And the wars against royalist forces would drag on for years, drawing the young nation into battles from the deserts of the Northwest to the heights of the Andes, where the campaigns of José de San Martín would carry the fight beyond Argentina's borders into Chile and Peru. Thus, the first independence movements were not a single, triumphant surge, but a series of tides, advances and retreats, proclamations and compromises, victories tempered by the sobering knowledge that to declare a nation was not the same as to build one. And in the plazas where crowds once demanded the removal of a viceroy, in the dusty camps where soldiers drilled under tattered banners, and in the echoing halls of provincial assemblies, there lingered both the pride of having seized a moment that might never come again and the uneasy awareness that the storms of war and politics had only just begun to gather on the horizon. When the news reached Buenos Aires in May of 1810 that the Spanish king remained a prisoner in France, and that the central authority in Spain itself had collapsed into a patchwork of juntas struggling to assert legitimacy in the face of Napoleon's occupation, it was as if a door that had long been bolted shut was suddenly blown open by a storm no one could stop. And through it poured not only the accumulated frustrations of decades under mercantilist restriction and distant governance, but also the heady conviction, nourished by Enlightenment ideals and recent military successes, that the people of the Rio de la Plata could and must take their fate into their own hands. The week that followed, now remembered as the Semana de Mayo, unfolded like the uncoiling of a spring wound tight for years, beginning with murmured meetings in the Cabildo, swelling into open debates between loyalists who insisted on waiting for clear orders from Spain and reformists who argued that authority had reverted to the people themselves, and culminating on May 25, 1810, when the crowd gathered in the Plaza Mayor under a chill autumn sky. pressing against the doors of the government house until the viceroy, Baltasar Hidalgo de Cisneros, was forced to step aside and a new Primera Junta was proclaimed. Its members drawn from the ranks of local patriots who promised to govern in the name of the deposed Ferdinand VII, but whose true course was already veering toward full independence. This was not yet a clean break. The rhetoric still cloaked in loyalty to a captive monarch, the moves calculated to avoid provoking outright war with Spain while consolidating local power. But the forces unleashed could not easily be contained. For once, the notion took hold that governance could be rooted in the will of the people, rather than the distant command of a king. Every policy, every decree, every troop movement was weighed not only for its practical effect, but for what it signaled about the future and in the countryside. In the towns along the Paraná, in the Andean foothills, there were those who began to see themselves not as subjects, but as citizens of something yet unnamed. The years that followed were marked by both inspiration and hardship, as the newly formed government faced the dual challenge of defending its position against Spanish royalist forces, many entrenched in Upper Peru, the vital corridor to the mineral wealth of Potosí, and of persuading the disparate provinces to unite behind a single cause. For while Buenos Aires had lit the spark, not all regions were eager to follow its lead, and the tensions between centralism and federalism, between the port and the interior, already began to show in disputes over trade, military command, and representation. Leaders emerged whose names would be etched into the national memory. Manuel Belgrano, lawyer turned general who carried the revolutionary flag across the north. Juan José Castelli, the orator of the revolution, whose speeches fused political theory with fierce denunciations of tyranny. And Mariano Moreno, the sharp-minded secretary of the junta, whose vision of a republic was as radical as it was uncompromising, and whose sudden death at sea in 1811 left a wound in the movement's early leadership. But leadership was as perilous as it was necessary. For the path toward independence was strewn with defeats, betrayals, and the grinding reality of a war fought over vast distances with scarce resources. By 1816, after years of campaigns and shifting alliances, representatives from the provinces gathered in the Congress of Tucumán, where the veil of nominal loyalty to Ferdinand VII was finally cast aside, and on July 9th, they declared the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata to be free and independent, a statement as bold as it was fraught, for independence in name did not yet mean security in fact. And the wars against royalist forces would drag on for years, drawing the young nation into battles from the deserts of the Northwest to the heights of the Andes, where the campaigns of José de San Martín would carry the fight beyond Argentina's borders into Chile and Peru. Thus, the first independence movements were not a single triumphant surge, but a series of tides, advances and retreats, proclamations and compromises, victories tempered by the sobering knowledge that to declare a nation was not the same as to build one. And in the plazas where crowds once demanded the removal of a viceroy, in the dusty camps where soldiers drilled under tattered banners, and in the echoing halls of provincial assemblies, there lingered both the pride of having seized a moment that might never come again and the uneasy awareness that the storms of war and politics had only just begun to gather on the horizon. By the closing decades of the 19th century, after the dust of many internal wars had begun to settle and the long arm of the central government had extended its reach more firmly over the provinces, Argentina found itself entering a period that, in the eyes of much of the world, shimmered with the promise of modernity and prosperity. A transformation driven by the convergence of fertile land, advancing technology, and a global demand for foodstuffs that the country was uniquely positioned to supply. For the endless grass seas of the Pampas, once the domain of roaming herds and gaucho riders, were now being reshaped into a vast engine of agricultural export, with beef and wheat flowing outward in quantities that astonished both the producers and their foreign buyers. The revolution was as much technological as it was economic. For while cattle had roamed the Pampas since the earliest colonial days, it was only with the advent of refrigerated shipping in the 1870s that Argentina could send fresh beef across the Atlantic to Europe, arriving not as salted or dried meat, but as the tender, flavorful cuts prized in the markets of London and Paris. And this new capacity transformed the ranching economy into a source of immense wealth, spurring investment in railways to carry livestock from the interior to the ports, in slaughterhouses and packing plants equipped with the latest machinery, and in the consolidation of enormous estates whose owners, often of elite Criollo families or newly enriched foreign investors, wielded power not only over the land, but over the very direction of national policy. With prosperity came the need for labor on a scale the local population could not supply. And into this gap flowed one of the most significant migrations in Argentina's history. As ships from Genoa, Naples, Barcelona, and other ports of southern Europe carried hundreds of thousands of immigrants, Italians, Spaniards, and smaller numbers of French, Germans, and Eastern Europeans, across the ocean in search of a better life. Their arrival swelling the population of Buenos Aires and other cities, turning them into bustling, cosmopolitan hubs where languages mingled in the markets, in the docks, in the workshops, and on the crowded tenement balconies that overlooked streets alive with the clatter of carts and the music of street performers. The newcomers did not arrive into a vacuum, but into a society already stratified by class, ethnicity, and political influence. And while many found work as dock workers, artisans, or railway laborers, others moved into the countryside as tenant farmers, arrendatarios, or sharecroppers, medieros, whose toil on land they did not own nonetheless bound them to the great export engine. Some would save enough to purchase small plots, joining the rural middle class, while others remained in a cycle of precarious dependence, vulnerable to fluctuations in commodity prices and to the policies of governments more concerned with courting foreign investment than with securing the rights of workers. Culturally, the impact of immigration was profound. As Italian dialects mixed with lunfardo slang in the working-class barrios of Buenos Aires, giving shape to a new urban identity whose voice was as likely to be heard in the mournful strains of the emerging tango as in the speeches of labor organizers calling for better conditions. Cafes, theaters, and social clubs became meeting places not only for entertainment, but for the exchange of ideas, socialist, anarchist, and republican, that carried echoes of the political ferment of Europe into the political life of Argentina. For the elites, the influx of European immigrants was often framed in the language of progress and civilization, part of a larger project of whitening and Europeanizing the nation in line with the prevailing racial ideologies of the time. And official policies encouraged the settlement of Europeans while marginalizing or outright excluding indigenous and non-European communities from the imagined national future. The conquest of the desert in the 1870s. A military campaign that expanded the frontier by violently displacing indigenous peoples in Patagonia and the Pampas was both a cause and a consequence of this vision, opening new lands for ranching and farming, while erasing much of the remaining autonomy of native populations. By the turn of the century, Argentina was widely regarded as one of the richest countries in the world per capita. Its capital, a city of grand boulevards, ornate opera houses, and cafes that could rival those of Paris, and its rural estates symbols of a landed aristocracy whose wealth was measured in thousands of head of cattle and kilometers of wheat fields. Yet beneath this glittering exterior lay tensions between the landed elite and the swelling working class, between the promise of opportunity and the reality of exploitation. Tensions that would in time spill into the politics of the 20th century. shaping the course of a nation that had built its modern identity on the twin pillars of the Pampas and the port. At the dawn of the 20th century, Argentina stood on a precipice of possibility. A nation whose fertile plains and bustling ports had made it a darling of foreign investors, whose capital gleamed with the architectural ambitions of an elite eager to present Buenos Aires as the Paris of South America, and whose per capita wealth placed it among the world's most prosperous countries. Yet beneath this polished facade, there pulsed a complex and volatile reality in which economic abundance was unequally shared. Political participation remained limited, and the social fabric was stretched taut between the expectations of an ascendant working class and the guarded privileges of a conservative oligarchy that intended to hold the reins of power tightly in its grasp. For decades, the political order had been dominated by the Partido Autonomista Nacional, PAN, a party whose mastery of electoral manipulation, open voting, intimidation, and outright fraud ensured the continuity of elite control. But the growing demands for reform, fueled by an expanding middle class, the agitation of socialist and anarchist movements among immigrant workers, and the mounting discontent in provinces marginalized by Buenos Aires' centralism, made the maintenance of this system increasingly precarious. The breakthrough came with the Ley Sáenz Peña of 19, which mandated secret, universal, for men, and compulsory voting. A reform that would upend the balance of political power and bring to office in 1916 Hipólito Yrigoyen of the Radical Civic Union, UCR, the first president elected under the new democratic rules. Yrigoyen's presidency marked a profound shift as he sought to broaden political inclusion, mediate labor disputes, and extend the state's role in regulating the economy, earning him the affectionate title of the Father of the Poor among supporters and the enduring suspicion of the landed elite and conservative press, who saw in his populist style and pragmatic alliances a threat to the established order. Yet even as the machinery of democracy expanded, the underlying tensions of Argentina's social and economic model remained unresolved. For the country's prosperity still hinged on its role as an exporter of primary goods, beef and grain, to industrial Europe, leaving it vulnerable to the tremors of global markets. Those tremors came with devastating force in the wake of the 1929 Wall Street crash and the ensuing Great Depression, which slashed demand for Argentine exports, drove unemployment to unprecedented levels, and ignited political unrest that neither Yrigoyen, in his second term beginning 1928, nor his government could fully contain. By 1930, discontent within the military, nurtured by conservative civilian factions, erupted into the first successful coup d'etat in Argentine history, as General José Félix Uriburu ousted Yrigoyen, setting a precedent that would haunt the nation for much of the 20th century. The decade that followed, remembered as the Década Infame or infamous decade, saw the restoration of oligarchic control through a combination of electoral fraud, economic dependence on Britain reinforced by the controversial Roca-Runciman Pact, and repression of political dissent, all while the military loomed as a silent arbiter of power. And though democratic forms were maintained, their substance was hollowed out, as governments served the twin imperatives of appeasing foreign investors and maintaining a domestic status quo that kept the benefits of recovery in the hands of a narrow elite. Yet Argentina's political landscape was not static. For the interwar years also witnessed the continued growth of organized labor, the spread of nationalist currents within the armed forces, and the emergence of a younger generation of officers and politicians convinced that the liberal oligarchic order could neither defend national sovereignty nor address the inequities that undermined social cohesion. When the Second World War disrupted global trade and exposed Argentina's strategic importance as both an agricultural supplier and a geopolitical pivot in South America, these forces would converge in ways that set the stage for the most transformative and polarizing figure of the century to step onto the political stage. When Juan Domingo Perón first emerged from the ranks of the military officers who had seized power in the 1943 coup, it was not immediately clear that he would come to dominate Argentina's political life for decades to come. Yet his keen instinct for the rhythms of public sentiment, his ability to speak in the language of both the barracks and the factory floor, and his understanding that the tides of post-war politics demanded a new social pact between the state, labor, and capital, allowed him to rise rapidly, first as head of the newly created Secretariat of Labor and Social Welfare, then as Vice President and Minister of War, and finally, propelled by a groundswell of working-class support as President in 1946. Elected with a mandate to transform Argentina into a nation where the voice of the descamisados, the shirtless ones, would carry as much weight as the pronouncements of the patrician elite. Central to Perón's appeal was his mastery of political theater and social reform, a combination that was both sincere in its recognition of labor's needs and shrewd in its consolidation of political loyalty. Under his government, wages rose, working hours were regulated, social security was expanded, and benefits from paid vacations to housing programs became tangible evidence of a state that, for the first time in many workers' lives, seemed to stand on their side. While a new network of powerful unions, closely aligned with Peronism, gave organized labor a direct seat at the table of national policy, reinforcing a feedback loop of support that bound the fate of the government to the fortunes of the working class. Alongside him, and in some ways eclipsing him in the hearts of the people, stood Eva Duarte de Perón, Evita, whose journey from provincial obscurity to First Lady became a living emblem of the Peronist promise that the humble could rise, that the poor could be seen and heard. Through her tireless work with the Eva Perón Foundation, she distributed aid, built schools and hospitals, championed women's suffrage, which was achieved in 1947, and cultivated an almost mystical connection with Argentina's marginalized, her speeches blending fierce defiance of the elite with an emotional appeal that made her, for millions, the true soul of the movement. Yet Peronism was never merely a program of social justice. It was also a deliberate restructuring of political power, in which opposition was tolerated only within limits. The press was brought under tighter control, and institutions were reshaped to ensure the dominance of the movement, leading critics to decry it as authoritarian, even as its supporters hailed it as the fullest expression of democracy. Foreign policy, too, was marked by a stubborn insistence on autonomy, as Perón sought to steer a third position between U.S. capitalism and Soviet communism during the Cold War, frustrating both camps while cultivating ties with nations that shared his emphasis on sovereignty. The economic model that underpinned Perón's first presidency relied heavily on the favorable post-war terms of trade, as high demand for Argentine agricultural exports provided the revenues to fund industrialization, infrastructure, and welfare programs. But as global conditions shifted in the early 1950s, foreign reserves dwindled, inflation rose, and shortages began to bite, eroding the prosperity that had fueled his popularity. Opposition from traditional elites, segments of the military, and sectors of the Catholic Church grew sharper, especially after Evita's death in 1952, a loss that left the movement without its most potent symbol of compassion and sacrifice. By 1955, the tensions had reached a breaking point. Massive street demonstrations by both Peronist loyalists and their opponents, a failed uprising, and finally a successful coup by a coalition of military officers and civilians forced Perón into exile, first in Paraguay and later in Spain, marking the end of his initial era in power, but not the end of Peronism, which, far from disappearing, became a persistent force in Argentine politics. a banner under which workers, nationalists, and populists of varying stripes would continue to rally, whether in defiance of military regimes or in the corridors of elected government. When Juan Domingo Perón returned from exile in 1973, carried back into office on a wave of nostalgia, labor militancy, and the yearning of millions who believed his second coming would restore stability to a country fractured by years of coups, economic decline, and political violence. The promise was as bright as it was fragile. For the Argentina he re-entered was no longer the one he had left 2 decades earlier. Its society was more polarized, its economy more unstable, and its political landscape littered with factions that claimed the Peronist legacy while clashing bitterly over what it should mean. And when Perón died in July 1974, leaving the presidency to his third wife, Isabel Martínez de Perón, the fragility of that promise became painfully, even fatally, apparent. Isabel, lacking both the political instinct and the commanding authority of her husband, presided over a government besieged from the start. On one side by right-wing Peronist paramilitaries, such as the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, AAA, who waged a campaign of intimidation and murder against leftist activists, union leaders, and intellectuals. And on the other, by increasingly radicalized guerrilla groups like the Montoneros and the People's Revolutionary Army, ERP, whose bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations escalated the cycle of violence until the entire country seemed gripped by a fever of mutual destruction. Each act of bloodshed justifying the next, each victim feeding the narrative of an existential threat that demanded extraordinary measures. The military, which had long seen itself as the ultimate guardian of order and national destiny, watched this descent into chaos with a mixture of alarm and calculation. And on March 24, 1976, tanks rolled through the streets of Buenos Aires in yet another coup. This one deposing Isabel Perón and installing a junta headed by General Jorge Rafael Videla, Admiral Emilio Massera, and Brigadier Orlando Agosti, who promised to restore peace and rebuild the economy, but whose true legacy would be written in the shadows of cells, in the screams behind soundproof walls, and in the absence of tens of thousands of people who would never return. The Proceso de Reorganización Nacional, as the dictatorship euphemistically called itself, launched the so-called Dirty War, an unrelenting campaign against what it defined as subversion, a definition so broad and so deliberately vague that it encompassed armed insurgents, student activists, journalists, priests advocating for the poor, mothers who asked too many questions, and often anyone whose appearance, reading habits, or circle of friends attracted suspicion. In clandestine detention centers scattered across the country, men and women were tortured with electric shocks, beaten, sexually assaulted, drugged, and in many cases, disappeared, loaded onto death flights over the Rio de la Plata or the Atlantic and dropped into the water, their bodies swallowed by the currents. Officially, the regime denied the existence of the desaparecidos, but their absence became impossible to ignore. And the courage of the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, mothers wearing white headscarves embroidered with the names of their missing children, marching silently in front of the presidential palace every Thursday, pierced the government's wall of fear, forcing the world to look more closely at what was happening in Argentina, even as the junta sought to project an image of discipline and modernity abroad. The dictatorship's brutality was matched by its economic experiments, which, under Economy Minister José Alfredo Martínez de Hoz, embraced neoliberal policies favoring foreign investment, deregulation, and the opening of markets. Measures that enriched a small elite but deepened inequality, eroded local industry, and left the country vulnerable to mounting debt. And as public discontent grew in the early 1980s, the junta sought a unifying distraction in nationalism, seizing the Falkland Islands, Islas Malvinas, from Britain in April 1982, an act that initially rallied popular support, but quickly unraveled when British forces retook the islands in a swift and humiliating defeat. That loss shattered the aura of invincibility that the military had cultivated, emboldening calls for democracy and accountability. And by 1983, facing mass protests, economic collapse, and international condemnation, the generals relinquished power, paving the way for the election of Raúl Alfonsín and the return of civilian rule. Yet the scars of the dirty war remained, etched into families still searching for the truth about their loved ones, into the testimonies of survivors who recounted horrors beyond imagining, and into a national memory that could never again pretend that state violence was a distant possibility rather than a lived reality. When Raúl Alfonsín took the presidential oath on December 10, 1983, standing before a sea of Argentines who had filled the plazas with chants, banners, and the raw hope of a people emerging from the long night of dictatorship, the air was thick with both relief and expectation. For this was not merely the transfer of power from one leader to another, but the symbolic rebirth of the republic itself. A moment in which the wounds of the past were acknowledged even as the promise of a democratic future was proclaimed. And yet beneath the soaring rhetoric and the jubilant crowds lay a daunting reality. The new government would have to navigate an economy in crisis, a military still capable of menace, and a society that demanded both justice for the crimes of the dirty war and stability after years of repression and fear. From the outset, Alfonsín made human rights the moral foundation of his presidency, establishing the Comisión Nacional sobre la Desaparición de Personas, CONADEP, to investigate the fate of the desaparecidos. And within months, the Nunca Más report laid bare the machinery of state terror. Hundreds of clandestine detention centers, thousands of documented cases of torture, murder, and disappearance. Its pages both a testament to truth and an indictment of those who had ordered and carried out the atrocities. Unprecedented trials of the top junta leaders followed in 1985, marking the first time since Nuremberg that a civilian court had prosecuted former military rulers for crimes against humanity. And although these convictions were celebrated internationally, the proceedings also ignited fierce resistance within the armed forces, culminating in military uprisings that forced Alfonsín to concede partial amnesties, a compromise that left many victims' families feeling betrayed, even as it preserved the fragile democratic order. Economically, the challenge was no less formidable, for Argentina had inherited from the dictatorship not only a battered industrial base, but also runaway inflation, massive foreign debt, and a deeply unequal distribution of wealth. Alfonsín's government experimented with wage price agreements, austerity measures, and in 1985, the Austral Plan, a bold attempt to curb hyperinflation through the introduction of a new currency, the Austral, coupled with fiscal tightening and wage controls, which briefly slowed price increases but failed to address structural weaknesses, leading to renewed inflationary spirals that eroded public confidence and sapped the government's political strength. By the late 1980s, as inflation accelerated toward hyperinflation, wages collapsed and shortages returned. The optimism of 1983 had given way to frustration, and Alfonsín, besieged by strikes, protests, and economic turmoil, cut his term short by 6 months, handing over power in July 1989 to Carlos Menem, a flamboyant Peronist governor from La Rioja, whose populist campaign promises of productive revolution masked an agenda that would soon pivot sharply toward neoliberal reform. Menem's presidency, which began amid chaos, looting in the streets, inflation running at thousands of percent annually, ushered in a program of sweeping privatizations, deregulation, and market liberalization under Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo. The most dramatic move came in 1991 with the convertibility plan. which pegged the Argentine peso 1-to-1 to the US dollar, bringing sudden and dramatic stability to prices, restoring foreign investor confidence, and fueling a consumption boom that transformed the urban landscape with imported goods, foreign cars, and an explosion of credit. For a time, the reforms seemed to vindicate Menem's audacity, as growth returned and inflation became a memory. But the model's dependence on foreign capital, the loss of competitiveness from an overvalued currency, and the social costs of privatization, including mass layoffs and the widening of inequality, planted the seeds of a future crisis. Meanwhile, corruption scandals, allegations of cronyism, and the concentration of executive power tarnished the government's democratic credentials, revealing that political stability did not necessarily translate into institutional strength. Thus, the return to democracy in 1983 had opened a new chapter in Argentina's history, one in which the ballot box replaced the barracks. Human rights were inscribed into the nation's conscience, and economic modernization promised a path out of decades of instability. But it was also a chapter written in the uneasy ink of compromise, where the pursuit of justice was tempered by the fear of renewed military unrest, and where economic growth was pursued at the risk of repeating the very cycles of boom and bust that had long haunted the Argentine dream. By the end of the 1990s, the very policies that had once been hailed as the saviors of Argentina's economy were beginning to reveal themselves as the architects of its undoing for the fixed 1-to-1 peg between the peso and the US dollar. So effective in taming the monster of hyperinflation, had become a cage from which the country could not easily escape, locking Argentina into an overvalued currency that strangled exports, rewarded imports, and drained competitiveness, even as the cost of maintaining the parity through borrowing swelled the national debt to levels that could no longer be sustained without perpetual infusions of foreign credit. A lifeline that frayed with every sign of slowing growth and deepening recession. Global shocks, most notably the Asian financial crisis of 1997, the Russian default of 1998, and the devaluation of Brazil's currency in 1999, further eroded Argentina's position, exposing its dependence on external markets and leaving it vulnerable to capital flight. While at home, the promise of the 1990s privatization boom had curdled into a bitter reality of rising unemployment, shrinking industrial output, and an ever-widening gap between the wealthy few and the struggling many. By the time Fernando de la Rua, a lawyer from the Radical Civic Union, took office in late 1999 on a pledge to restore honesty and stability, the country was already sliding toward a precipice whose depth few fully grasped. De la Rua's administration, constrained by the currency peg and unwilling to break with orthodox economic prescriptions, doubled down on austerity measures in a desperate attempt to maintain investor confidence, cutting public spending, reducing pensions, and raising taxes. Policies that may have reassured creditors, but that deepened the recession, fueling anger among workers, small business owners, and the growing ranks of the unemployed. As the economy contracted and debt repayments consumed a greater share of state revenues, the International Monetary Fund stepped in with loans conditioned on even harsher fiscal discipline, a medicine that only worsened the patient's condition. By late 2001, the crisis had reached a breaking point. Bank deposits were fleeing the country at alarming rates. The government's reserves were evaporating, and in December, Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo returned to office in a last-ditch bid to calm markets, announced the Corralito, a set of measures that froze most bank withdrawals and limited cash access for ordinary citizens, ostensibly to protect the financial system, but in practice, locking millions of people away from their own savings. The backlash was immediate and furious, with pot-banging protests, cacerolazos, erupting in Buenos Aires and across the nation, their metallic clamor echoing off apartment buildings and into the halls of government as an unmistakable demand for change. The streets became the stage for a society in revolt. Unemployed workers blocked highways and piquets. Middle-class families marched alongside them. The unemployed and the recently impoverished finding common cause in their rage at a political class they saw as corrupt, inept, and indifferent. Clashes with police turned deadly, leaving dozens dead and hundreds injured in scenes broadcast across the world. And as the chaos mounted, President de la Rua attempted to declare a state of siege, only to find that the gesture, rather than imposing order, fanned the flames, transforming discontent into open defiance. On December 20th, 2001, de la Rua resigned, fleeing the Casa Rosada in a helicopter whose departure, caught by television cameras, became an enduring image of a government in collapse. In the days that followed, the country cycled through a dizzying succession of presidents, 5 in less than 2 weeks, as Congress, the provinces, and party leaders scrambled to restore some semblance of authority, eventually settling on Eduardo Duhalde, who in early 2002 abandoned the peso dollar peg, triggering a massive devaluation that halved the value of savings overnight, plunged millions into poverty, and sent shockwaves through every level of Argentine society. The 2001 collapse was not merely an economic event, but a political and cultural rupture. A moment when the unspoken pact between the people and their institutions, fragile though it had always been, shattered under the weight of betrayal, mismanagement, and systemic fragility. And in the aftermath, Argentina entered a period of profound reckoning, in which the old certainties of the 1990s were swept away, replaced by the urgent question of how to rebuild an economy, a democracy, and a collective sense of purpose from the wreckage of a dream that had promised modernity and delivered ruin. In the years that followed the collapse of 2001, Argentina began the slow and uneven process of stitching itself back together. Not through any single moment of triumph, but through a patchwork of policies, improvisations, and political turns that reflected both the resilience of its people and the chronic fragility of its institutions. For the trauma of the Corralito and the mass impoverishment it unleashed had left deep scars on the national psyche, shaping every subsequent debate about economics, governance, and the very meaning of sovereignty in a world where global markets could so quickly turn from benefactors to executioners. Under President Eduardo Duhalde, the immediate priority was survival, managing the freefall caused by the devaluation of the peso, the default on foreign debt, and the collapse of public confidence. Yet, it was also during this transitional period that the groundwork was laid for a new political era, one that would take full shape with the election of Nestor Kirchner in 2003. A relatively little-known governor from the southern province of Santa Cruz, whose narrow electoral victory belied the impact he would have in reorienting the country's course, both domestically and abroad. Kirchner's presidency, marked by a combative style and a refusal to bow to the dictates of international financial institutions, prioritized economic recovery through heterodox measures, renegotiating Argentina's defaulted debt at deep discounts, maintaining a competitive exchange rate to stimulate exports, and using the fiscal space created by a commodities boom to fund expansive social programs. Unemployment fell sharply, poverty rates declined, and the years of his presidency were accompanied by a renewed sense of national assertiveness, particularly in his decision to reopen human rights trials against former military officials, overturning the amnesty laws that had shielded them and signaling that the crimes of the dictatorship would no longer be left unresolved in the name of political convenience. When Kirchner stepped aside in 2007 and his wife, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, succeeded him, the continuity of their political project, known broadly as Kirchnerismo, was as evident as the intensification of its polarizing nature. For while supporters saw in their administrations a commitment to social justice, income redistribution, and the defense of national interests against foreign capital. Critics decried them as populists who eroded institutional checks, manipulated statistics, and fostered clientelism. Cristina's 2 terms, from 2007 to 2015, spanned the highs of sustained growth fueled by soy exports and domestic consumption, as well as the lows of inflationary pressures, currency controls, and increasingly confrontational relations with both the media and the judiciary. Internationally, Kirchnerismo aligned itself with the wave of left-leaning governments that swept much of Latin America in the early 21st century, forging close ties with Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, supporting regional integration initiatives such as UNASUR, and positioning Argentina as a vocal critic of neoliberal orthodoxy, while at home, policies like the nationalization of the pension system and the oil company YPF were celebrated by some as acts of economic sovereignty and condemned by others as reckless interventions that discouraged investment. The pendulum swung again in 2015 with the election of Mauricio Macri, a center-right businessman and former mayor of Buenos Aires, whose promise to normalize Argentina's economy through market-friendly reforms, attract foreign investment, and reintegrate the country into global markets appealed to those weary of inflation, trade restrictions, and political confrontation. Yet Macri's tenure, though marked initially by optimism and a lifting of currency controls, was soon mired in fiscal deficits, rising debt, and another turn to the IMF for assistance. An irony not lost on a public that had lived through the consequences of the fund's prescriptions in earlier decades. By 2019, the electorate swung back once more, returning Peronismo to power with the election of Alberto Fernandez, who campaigned alongside Cristina Fernández de Kirchner as his vice president, a pairing that symbolized both the enduring influence of Kirchnerismo and the inability of any political force to fully escape the gravitational pull of Argentina's cyclical struggles. Almost immediately, Fernandez's administration faced the dual crises of a deepening recession and the COVID-19 pandemic, whose lockdowns, health emergencies, and economic disruptions intensified existing vulnerabilities, pushing poverty rates higher and reigniting debates over debt, subsidies, and the sustainability of the social safety net. Thus, contemporary Argentina remains a nation defined by contrasts, its culture and identity as vibrant and unifying as ever, embodied in the poetry of Tango, the mythology of the Pampas, and the global glory of its football triumphs, yet its politics marked by sharp polarization, its economy subject to recurring bouts of inflation, currency instability, and debt renegotiations. And through it all, the Argentine people have continued to adapt, protest, create, and hope, inhabiting a country where history does not so much progress in a straight line as it turns in great, looping circles, each generation confronting anew the questions of how to balance justice and pragmatism, autonomy and integration, memory and progress. To speak of Argentina at the close of this long arc of history is to speak of a country that has learned over centuries of triumph and collapse, of revolutions fought in the mud and coups plotted in the marble corridors of power, of cattle grazing under an endless sky and factories standing silent in the wake of crisis. That identity is not a static possession, but a dance between memory and reinvention. And like the tango that was born in the humid nights of Buenos Aires' working-class barrios, it is a dance in which steps of longing and loss are inextricable from those of passion and defiance. For the tango itself, melancholic yet fierce, intimate yet public, is not merely a cultural export or a tourist spectacle, but a distillation of the Argentine soul, carrying in its swaying embrace the migrations of Italians and Spaniards, the pulse of African rhythms brought in chains, the laments of gauchos displaced from the Pampas, and the sighs of lovers who know that beauty is most vivid when it is fleeting. And so too has the nation's history been a choreography of contrasts. Each figure, whether measured or sudden, shaped by the interplay between resilience and fragility, between the yearning for order and the irrepressible surge of autonomy. It is tempting, in telling such a story, to search for the moment when the storms cease and the horizon clears, when the lessons of the past at last take root in the soil of the present. Yet Argentina's path resists such tidy conclusions. For the cycles of boom and bust, of democracy and authoritarianism, of unity and fracture, have not so much been broken as transformed. Each recurrence bearing the imprint of those before it, altered by memory, yet never entirely freed from the gravitational pull of history's patterns. And still, to reduce Argentina to its crises would be to miss the stubborn, incandescent light that burns in its people. The same light that carried them through the terror of the dirty war. Through the breadlines of the Great Depression and the empty shelves of 2001. Through the endless negotiations with creditors and the confrontations in the streets. A light that finds expression not only in the grand gestures of politics, but in the small acts of daily persistence. A father teaching his child to dribble a football in a narrow alley. A grandmother stirring a pot of stew while recounting the stories of the village she left behind. A young couple swaying in the corner of a crowded cafe as a bandoneon sighs in the background. In this way, Argentina endures as both an idea and a place. A nation that has stood at the summit of global prosperity and at the brink of collapse, that has given the world poets and generals, saints and scoundrels, and that has never entirely surrendered to the forces that would define it solely by its failures. It is a country whose capital can dazzle with the elegance of Paris, while its rural heart beats to the rhythm of hooves across the Pampas, whose people can argue with volcanic intensity about politics one moment, and join together in raucous celebration of a football victory the next. And perhaps this is the truest lesson that its history offers. Not that storms can be avoided, nor that they can be mastered once and for all, but that in their midst, a people can still choose to dance, to find in the very turbulence of life the steps that will carry them forward, even if the music changes, even if the floor shifts beneath their feet. For Argentina, like the tango, is not about arriving at a final pose, but about the unbroken movement between tension and release, between holding on and letting go, between the pride of the past and the uncertainty of what lies ahead. Always turning, always adapting, always somehow keeping time with the music, even when the storm refuses to end. Argentina's story is not just history. It is a living rhythm, equal parts heartbreak and pride, a reminder that a nation's soul can endure even when its fortunes rise and fall. If you want more journeys through the storms and triumphs of nations, subscribe to Stories of Countries and keep traveling with us through the past that shapes our world today.